Hi there, I'm Jim Zirin. Welcome back for more conversations. Gary Ginsberg is with us. Gary Ginsberg is a lawyer, a political strategist, a corporate strategist with over 25 years of experience. Gary Ginsberg has written a fabulous new book entitled First Friends, which is about the special relationships between 9 presidents and people outside the White House who appear to be extremely influential in their lives. We're delighted to welcome Gary Ginsberg to the program. Well, hi, Gary. Wonderful to see you, and thanks for doing this, and congratulations on your book. It's an instant bestseller and a very easy read. You just race right through it. But tell us something about the book and how you came to write it and how long it took you and the research you did. First Friends, my gosh.
First Friends, yes. I came upon the idea in April of 2018. I think I literally woke up in the morning with this sense that I had to write this book. And I think it was a product of having thought about the presidency and lived in part my life around the presidency, really since 1984, when I worked for the Gary Hart presidential campaign. And I witnessed for the first time the role of a first friend in the body of Warren Beatty, the famed Hollywood actor. And I saw how he provided this kind of blunt advice and the respite that nobody else on Gary Hart's presidential campaign could. He would say, "Stop talking and acting like a politician, Gary." And Warren Beatty knew a thing or two about stagecraft, and Hart would listen to him in a way that he didn't his staff. And he would also go out to dinner late at night with Beatty, and Beatty would relax him and give him that release from the pressures of the campaign in a way that nobody else could. And I thought, wow, what an unusual role that is. And I saw that same dynamic play out again in 1992 with Bill Clinton and Vernon Jordan. And I think it was those two experiences combined with the fact that I didn't think that Donald Trump had that kind of person around him to provide that blunt truth, to provide that antidote to loneliness and that respite from the pressures.
Well, you limit yourself to 9 presidents, same number as on the Supreme Court, but
it was not by design.
Did you consider a 10th first friend? I mean, immediately coming to mind, Jim Baker and George H.W. Bush, and undoubtedly there are many other examples.
Yeah, the 9 was really a function of how many pages I had written, how many pages my publisher wanted, and also the fact that I just came upon a deadline, a hard deadline. And had I written a 10th chapter, I would not have been Baker and Bush, because if you remember, Peter Baker and his wife, Susan Glazer, had written just a brilliant biography of Jim Baker. And I
had them on the program. They were marvelous.
Yeah. And so you know how exhaustive. They spent years researching that. And I really thought it would be hard to find anything new or anything original in the short time I had left. So I didn't do that. I did want to do Bush's son, though. And I spoke to his son's office. I know Bush's son-in-law quite well. And he went to Bush with the idea, and Bush loved it. And he said, "Yeah, I want to do it. And I want to talk about my best friendship with Don Evans, the Commerce Secretary. I want to talk about my first friendship with my brother, Marvin, which violated all of my rules, where I eliminated family and eliminated staff. And then I want to talk about my father's relationship with Jim Baker." And I agreed to those terms because I really wanted to do Bush, because he had so many great friendships.
Did you, in your research, come across presidents who were essentially loners? I mean, for example, Obama didn't seem to have a first friend, and certainly if Trump had a first friend, it was his Twitter feed.
That's exactly right. In fact, if you had asked me about Trump, I would say it was really the affirmation of the masses, which is all that Trump really needed for that affirmation, that emotional fulfillment that we get from friends. I would say that Obama, although he's a loner in part, I guess, has a number of very close friends, one of whom is a man named Marty Nesbitt. And I called Marty Nesbitt at the advice of a number of very, very close associates of Obama's. And he was delighted to talk to me. He said, "I've been waiting 5 years for somebody to call me to tell the story of my first friendship with Barack. And Barack's coming to Chicago next week. We share an office there. He's going to love this, and we will do this." I never heard from him again because Obama was writing his memoir. And I think he just didn't want to take the time to help somebody else's book when he was working on his own.
Yeah. Well, you treat essentially five periods in history, and these divisions are mine, but they seem to be convenient. There's the founding period. You have Jefferson and Madison. You have the Civil War period. You have Franklin Pierce, certainly an undistinguished president,
Indeed.
and Nathaniel Hawthorne, the writer, which is a surprising relationship.
Yeah.
Abraham Lincoln and Joshua Speed. Then you have World War I, the very curious relationship between Woodrow Wilson and Colonel Edward House, and World War II, Roosevelt and a woman, Daisy Suckley, which is interesting. We'll go into that. And then the post-war period, Truman and Eddie Jacobson. People think Eddie Jacobson was responsible for Truman's recognizing the state of Israel. It's an interesting footnote to history. And then you have Nixon and Bibi Rebozo, which may or may not be a dark relationship. And then you have finally the two people you knew well, Vernon Jordan and Bill Clinton. Now, of all these relationships that you looked at, how many of them would you say were emotional, and how many would you say were business?
That's a very interesting question. I would say that to some degree, they were all emotional. I think in order for that friendship to have been as important and durable as most were, with the exception of Colonel House, which was a recent friendship, forged only a year before Wilson became president, I would say that every president and his friend had an emotional component to it, which was why it had so much consequence. I think without that emotional component, it wouldn't have been as important a friendship and worthy of the book. So I would say they all did, but to your point, to varying degrees.
Well, which of the first friends would you regard as most influential? I mean, who were the real consiglieres, and who were just kind of palace court jesters?
Yeah, well, I would say if you look at the spectrum, we'll go from least to most. I would say Daisy Suckley probably had the least amount of influence on Franklin Roosevelt, but I didn't choose her because I was looking for influence. I chose her because I wanted to illustrate that emotional component and how important that can be, even in the absence of a substantive side. And so a lot of people have quibbled with me about her choice, saying, well, why wasn't it Harry Hopkins, or why wasn't it Missy LeHand? I thought that it really demonstrated how important a friend can be for a lonely president. And Roosevelt was among our most lonely, which seems curious because he's fighting a world war, he's fighting a depression. But as he said to Daisy Suckley one day, I'm either exhibit A or left entirely alone. And he didn't want to be left alone. And she was there for him whenever he felt that loneliness. And I thought that part of that filling that emptiness in his life really helped him to be a more settled, natural president than he otherwise would have been. So that, I think, on the extreme side of no consequence was Daisy. On the extreme side of having consequence, I think there's really three examples of that. One being Jefferson and Madison's friendship. I think it's the most important friendship in the history of America in terms of what it resulted in, which I think is some of the core structures of our democracy. I would say that what you alluded to earlier about Eddie Jacobson having a major consequence on an individual decision, it was him in going into the Oval Office and convincing Harry Truman to see Chaim Weizmann, which led to his recognition of the state of Israel. And then I'd say on a longer arc, it would have been David Ormsby Gore and the role that he played with Jack Kennedy in terms of shaping his foreign policy, both during his campaign for the presidency in 1960 and then in the conduct of foreign policy during his presidency.
I want to ask you about Eddie Jacobson, certainly a fascinating figure in history. Do you think it's really overblown that Truman would have met with Chaim Weizmann anyway, and that was really the decisive meeting and the decisive factor? Or certainly the yarn that everybody tells is that this guy who was his partner in a haberdashery store years ago in Missouri comes to the White House, gets in, no one knows how, and says, "Hey, Harry, you ought to recognize Israel." Do you think that's really how it happened?
Well, I'll tell you that Harry Truman himself, and maybe that is just because he wanted to throw a bone to his best friend, said it was only because of Eddie Jacobson's intervention that day in the White House that led him to see Chaim Weizmann. And it was that conversation which kind of broke the logjam in Truman's mind. He had become so frustrated with the issue, both on the Arab side as well as primarily on the Jewish American side, because he felt that they were putting so much pressure on him to recognize the state. And he said at one point in a cabinet meeting, Jesus Christ couldn't keep the Jews happy in his lifetime. How am I supposed to do it? And I think by the time Eddie walks into that Oval Office, I think Truman is just fed up. He has decided he is not going to see Weizmann. Weizmann, mind you, has been sitting in New York for a couple of weeks. He's a sickly man. And he only comes to New York for the express purpose of making that sale to Truman. And remember, Truman is under enormous pressure not to recognize the state. His Secretary of State, George Marshall, is dead set against it. And you're a student of history, you know how revered George Marshall was in 1948. And Truman is up for re-election that November. And he'll be damned if he's going to go against the most revered man by recognizing the state, with George Marshall opposed. So I think it was that combination of the political pressure not to do anything coming from inside his administration, as well as just that sense of frustration that led Truman to just say, "I'm done with the issue." And that's what he told Eddie on a number of occasions. That's what he had told everybody, is that he was going to leave it to the UN to decide. And if that were the case, nothing would have happened. There would have been no recognition of a Jewish state.
Well, presidents tend to shift in their attitudes, because remember what Truman said after he recognized the state of Israel. At the moment he recognized the state of Israel, he said, "Today I'm King Cyrus." And of
Yes,
course, Cyrus
right.
was the Persian king who led the Jews to the promised land.
Correct.
And now the Persians, the Iranians, have a different view of Israel and Israel of Iran. But
Indeed. Indeed.
so it seems that Truman had an almost messianic vision, or a
Yeah.
biblical vision of this whole episode.
That's exactly right. He was a devout Baptist. And so he had read the Bible, throughout his life. And I think he appreciated the Jewish connection to the land that had gone back 2 millennia. So I think he wanted to do it. To your point, would he have done it otherwise? He wanted to do it. I think in his kishkas, to use a Yiddish phrase, he felt it. But I think that he had been persuaded by Marshall and the State Department to probably not act in this moment, both for political reasons as well as for geopolitical reasons. And I think that sense of frustration was real. And I think it was just easier for him to not do anything. And that's why Eddie Jacobson becomes so important, because he appeals to him on an emotional level that no other staffer could have done.
Let's move on to another friendship, which is very, very interesting, and that's between David Ormsby Gore and John F. Kennedy.
Yeah.
Now, David Ormsby Gore really isn't like a first friend, first pal. Of course, he'd met Kennedy in 1939 when Kennedy was in England with his father, when his father was the ambassador. But Ormsby Gore was a professional diplomat. He'd been the foreign secretary of England. He was a distant relative of Kennedy. And when Harold Macmillan, who was also a distant relative, sent Ormsby Gore to Washington, I mean, he really made an important strategic decision. He wanted someone there who was experienced, who could have influence. Now, this doesn't sound like a friendship,
Correct.
really. It sounds like a courtier who was giving sage advice.
I would disagree with you on this one too. They met in 1938 in pre-war London. They were both, around 20 years old. They were both second sons of very powerful fathers. They forged a connection instantly based on their shared love of politics, gossip, going to the horse races, playing golf. They had instant shared values and instant shared interests. And I think that there was a real friendship that started in 1938 and really, as I hopefully traced in my chapter, continues relatively uninterrupted up through Kennedy's death in 1963. And not to drop a name here, but I called Kennedy's daughter, Caroline, to ask her who she thought her father's best friend was. And she said, David Ormsby Gore. She said, you're probably not even going to know who he is, but I can tell you that he was my father and my mother's best friend. The Ormsby Gores, Sissy Gore and David Gore, spent more time with my parents than any other couple during their presidency. And I think that's because of that same bond that I described in 1938. Kennedy really enjoyed being around Ormsby Gore, both because he loved his mind, but he also loved to play with him because they had so many shared interests. So I would say that it was actually a great combination. You asked me earlier about emotional versus substantive. I think this was really a perfect combination of the two. And on the substantive side, as we know, he really did play an important role in helping Kennedy think through how to approach those Soviet missiles in Cuba. And I think his advice was more sought by Kennedy than any other advisor around him. And Bobby Kennedy said afterward that Kennedy probably felt more comfortable intellectually discussing foreign policy with Ormsby Gore than anybody else. And that plays itself out both during the Cuban Missile Crisis and then when he comes up with this idea of supporting a limited nuclear test ban treaty in 1963. Without Ormsby Gore, you do not have that treaty, and you probably don't have as fast a deceleration of the Cold War as we saw over the next 25 years.
Okay, let's move on to two other friendships. One, Joshua Speed and Abraham Lincoln. Very curious friendship, particularly under modern standards. They slept in the same bed for, I think, 3.5 years, you say.
Yes.
Speed was from Kentucky. He is credited with keeping Kentucky in the Union, but he was also pro-slavery. So how do you account for a friendship of that sort?
Lincoln shows up looking for bedding, and he walks into Joshua Speed's store and he says, "You got any bedding?" And Speed says, "Yeah, I do, but it's $17." Lincoln doesn't have $17. So Speed says, "Well, go upstairs and check out my bed. If you like it, you can share it with me." So Lincoln walks up the staircase, looks at the bed, plops his stuff down on the bed, walks back downstairs and says, "Speed, I'm moved." And for the next 4 years, they forged an incredible friendship. Now, whether it was sexual or not, I can't say for certain. I don't think there's any evidence that it was. Some people have tried to promote that idea. But I think what we do know is that it was a deeply emotional friendship. They shared all their greatest fears together. They shared their aspirations. They spent all of their waking hours when they weren't at work together, eating meals, having a social club downstairs every night with their friends before they'd retired upstairs. So they forged this incredible friendship. And it really, I think, is illustrated most powerfully when Lincoln becomes suicidal. To basically tell Speed, "I'm thinking about killing myself. And will the world ever know the name Lincoln if I do?" He takes to his bed. Speed takes away all of his sharp objects to make sure he doesn't kill himself, ministers to him for a really hard month until Lincoln is back on his feet. It was that powerful friendship in those first 4 years that allows them to basically be apart for the next 19 years with, some interaction, intermittent interaction, but then they come back together so powerfully in 1860. And Lincoln immediately wants him in his government, which I found so interesting, right? He's a Democrat, he's a slave owner. Lincoln is a Republican who's really kind of moving further toward that abolitionist view. And yet he wants Speed by his side, which tells me something about how durable that friendship was. And then, as you say, I think it was really his efforts in Kentucky that kept Kentucky as a border state from seceding and helping Lincoln win the war.
Well, one role Speed played was that he recommended very strongly to a bashful Abraham Lincoln that he marry Todd, who became his wife, of course. And
Yes.
you contrast that with Colonel House, who recommended strongly that Wilson not marry his second wife, Edith. And Edith resented it so that she tried to break up the friendship, and in fact succeeded in doing it as time went on. But tell us a little bit about House and Wilson, and particularly there have been these recent allegations that Wilson, who I always thought of as a liberal icon, that couldn't have been a Franklin Roosevelt without a Woodrow Wilson, and now it appears Wilson's a racist. They took his name off the School of International Affairs at Princeton. Was House a racist too? He owned plantations. And he came from
There's no outward signs that House was a racist, although he thought when Wilson decided to resegregate the federal bureaucracy, which is the reason why 100 years later there has been this revisionist view of Wilson, and deservedly so, House didn't care. House went to McAdoo and thought it was much ado about nothing, and I write that in my book. I think the reason is that, unfortunately, in 1913, when he does it, the Democratic Party, for sure, is still a pretty racist party, and his cabinet, the Congress, was filled with Democrats who really just shrugged their shoulders at this resegregation. But House, I think what's unusual about this friendship, and it goes to your earlier question about how real these friendships were, he was really looking for the man and the opportunity to take his prominence in Texas and expand it nationally and internationally. But Wilson really needed a best friend at that moment. That's what I found so interesting. Wilson had one best friend and the Princeton faculty. I don't know if you remember that story, Jim, but it was a really nasty breakup when his best friend voted against him in a faculty vote when Wilson was the president of Princeton. And Wilson's daughter later wrote that it was one of the two great tragedies of his life, one being the loss of the League of Nations Treaty, the other was the loss of his best friend. So just at that moment in 1911, when House is looking for the man and the opportunity to become a big shot in the world, Wilson is looking for a best friend. So it's this perfect moment in time when these two men come together in November of 1911 and instantly forge a best friendship. Now, you may quibble whether it was transactional or not, but I don't think there's any doubt that it became almost overnight a deeply emotional, dependent friendship from both sides. And I think it was so dependent that, to your point, in 1915, when Wilson loses his first wife and marries Edith, Edith instantly recognizes how dependent Wilson is on this curious little man from Texas. And she doesn't want any competition for her, for her man. She wants to be the number one person in Wilson's life, not this curious man. So she sets out right away, even before they're married, to say, hey, Woodrow, this guy is just a sycophant. His language is so just disgustingly obsequious and flowery. He doesn't seem to me a strong man. He sounds to me like a jellyfish is the word she uses. And she tries to poison the friendship right off the bat, as you say. Yet House is playing this very prominent role in Wilson's life, both emotionally as well as policy-wise. He's running the foreign policy of the United States for 4 years.
Contrast between House and Ormsby Gore, because Ormsby Gore had immense foreign policy experience. He'd been the Foreign Secretary of Foreign Minister of England. And here you have House with no experience, and he's shaping the future of Europe and after the Treaty of Versailles.
Yeah, it's shocking that a man who had no accountability, no role, no security clearance, was running the foreign policy of the United States from 1913 to 1919. It could never happen again. But at one and the same time, think about it, Jim, he was the Secretary of State, the National Security Director, the CIA Director, the head of presidential personnel. He held all these titles just because of his friendship with Woodrow Wilson. It could not happen today.
In the modern era, you have Vernon Jordan and Bill Clinton. What was Vernon Jordan to Bill Clinton, and what was Bill Clinton to Vernon Jordan? And you witnessed that yourself.
I did. Well, I think that Vernon Jordan played a number of different roles for Bill Clinton throughout his life. Vernon Jordan, as you know, was a civil rights icon, led a number of major civil rights organizations in his formative years from 1960 to 1980, 81, 82, when he became a lawyer and a lobbyist. But the first thing he did was he kept Bill Clinton in the game. Bill Clinton was ready to quit politics, as I write in my chapter, after he lost his first re-election for Arkansas governor. And Vernon Jordan picks up the phone. He's only been friends with Clinton for 3 years at that point, but very good friends with Hillary for 11 years. So he says, I'm coming down to Little Rock to talk some sense into your husband, Bill. He flies down to Little Rock, and over a nearly 3-hour breakfast, basically single-handedly convinces Bill Clinton not to give up politics, not to move out of Arkansas, but to stay in the game. And 2 years later, he's reelected governor. And 10 years later, he's elected president of the United States. So that's the first role, is to be able to talk the really hard truth and go right at it with the principal and convince him to make a very hard decision, which he did. but he plays that role throughout.
And the rest, with a few bumps and grinds, is history as to the relationship between the two. So, but in any event, we've come to the end of our time, unfortunately, because this is just fabulous. But I have a question for you, Gary Ginsberg, author of the great book, First Friends, which I recommend to everybody. But are first friends good for the country?
I think for the most part, they are, Jim. I think the 9 stories that I write about, I think are ultimately very good for the man in terms of helping this person overcome difficulties during his life. And then I think it's good for the country in the way they basically play the role of first friend during their friend's presidency. So yes, I would say generally presidents who have first friends are the better for it.
First friends are good for the country. So Gary Ginsberg, thank you so much for coming by. Thank you for coming by. Tune in next week for more conversations. I'm Jim Zirin. Meanwhile, take care, be well, and all the best.